so glad that you could make our time to join us on today's episode of Tax Matters. My name is Olumiwa Matuloko, and we begin today's episode on a very triumphant note. Why? The West African Tax Administration Forum, which was conceived way back in 2011, has finally been born. At the 13th General Assembly of WATAF, which was held in Abuja, Nigeria's federal capital city, between the 21st and 22nd of March 2018, WATAF was officially unveiled to the world. It was a very joyous occasion, and the story of that unveiling, as well as General Assembly, will be the main focus on today's episode of Tax Matters. Because, as you will find out if you sit down to watch, so much went on that concerns you and I. For example, at the General Assembly, discussions revolved around two major issues: domestic resource mobilization across West Africa, as well as automatic exchange of information, which is now trending across the world. A few samples.
When we talk of domestic resource mobilization in Africa, we see three main themes. First one, the structure of the economy. We've heard already, formal economy, informal economy. We have a problem with the formal and informal economy. Regarding the informal economy, we have heard that a lot of transactions, revenue generation takes place there, but how much of that is actually translated back into the tax base? That's a big problem. The second problem is when a government decides to make a tax policy, does that policy actually help the country or hurt the country? Not just the tax policy, but also a policy for investment. And then the third one, capacity of enforcement and collection agencies. There are two issues here. The issue of training, education, knowledge, getting to know more about the tax system of the country. But then there's also the issue of, as a tax authority, you can know everything there is to know. But if you don't have the tools to go out and collect those taxes, then that knowledge is actually, quite frankly, futile.
A key challenge is the fact that today, in most of the sub-region, we have as much as between 60-70% of our GDP accounted by the informal sector. But today, most of the operators in the informal sector are not paying any taxes, not contributing to the government coffers when it comes to financing the government's needs.
If you're going to bring in the informal sector, the tax rules need to be simplified. It needs to be easy for them to understand. It needs to be easy for them to comply.
I believe our leaders are beginning to see that we can no longer rely on aid to fund our developmental agenda. The president of Ghana has been recorded to have said that he's leading a Ghana beyond aid. And I believe here in Nigeria also, we are beginning to say we are looking at Nigeria beyond oil, beyond reliance on oil. And if we look at the Tambo Mbeki report on illicit financial flow, it demonstrates clearly that what we get in aid is quite low compared with what is taken away from our country illegally by way of transfer. I like to call it transfer mispricing than even transfer pricing, and so many other schemes of multinational enterprises that operate in our country.
Taxpayers want to be comfortable that when they pay their taxes, they can see the results and the output of those taxes.
Date was Wednesday, the 21st of March 2018, and the leading lights of tax administration in West Africa were gathered in one room. Chief host was Babatunde Fowler, Executive Chairman, Federal Inland Revenue Service, Chairman, Joint Tax Board of Nigeria, and of course, the Chairman of WATAF's Continental Big Brother, ATAF, African Tax Administration Forum. Mr. Fowler began his address on an historical note.
Today, history is being made as WATAF makes its formal entry into the ranks of similar organizations focused on international collaboration in tax matters. This marks a new dawn in the consolidation of our collective aspirations to improve the standard of living of our people through effective mobilization of available domestic tax revenue. Now, West Africa has a platform for countries to collaborate in tax matters, solidly supported by our governments and a forum to articulate the project, the West African perspective in tax administration in the global tax arena.
Going further, Mr. Fowler spoke about what he called current-day realities that affect the work of the taxman.
To put these deliberations that we're about to hold in perspective, let me mention a few of our current-day realities. Nowadays, trade and commerce has become borderless, especially with the advent of e-commerce, hybrid financial instruments, coupled with increased sophistication and ingenuity of the army of tax advisors. At the receiving end are the host countries and its nationals, whose governments are losing revenue that ought to have been put in use for development. In Nigeria, we have in the past 2 years taken the route of increasing the use of ICT in facilitating tax compliance and introduce initiatives to improve interagency collaboration, all with a view to enhance tax administration, improve customer service, and reduce tax revenue leakages. Our efforts in this regard have made an impact and contributed to an increase in taxpayers by an additional 4 million taxpayers, companies and individuals, and an increase of over 700 billion naira, the equivalent of $2 billion in tax revenue in 2017, above taxes collected in 2016.
Still on the use of technology to enhance tax compliance.
To enhance taxpayers' compliance, we have rolled out various electronic web-based taxpayer services to make it easier for taxpayers to register, file tax returns, stamp duty their documents, and pay various taxes, obtain tax receipts and tax clearance certificates, all without having to visit the tax office. Be assured that Nigeria is willing to share our experience and support any country in the sub-region in implementing any of such e-taxpayer service initiatives.
Mr. Babatunde Oladapo is the Executive Secretary of WATAF.
Today is historical in that finally WATAF has come of age. It has been a long walk to get ratifications to formally establish us as an international organization. And today it is glad to note that we have 6 member countries, Nigeria leading the pack, Liberia, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea-Bissau. They have ratified the WATAF agreement and has given us the leeway to hold this event. And for those who have been wondering what is WATAF, proudly today we can say WATAF is the voice of tax administration in West Africa.
Then came the high point of the day, the official unveiling of WATAF, anchored by Mr. Salifu Temtore, Director of Customs at ECOWAS.
Value-added tax is a tax paid on all goods and services and remitted by the seller of the goods or provider of the service to government. 5% VAT is added to the total cost of goods and services in Nigeria, and when remitted to government is used for funding development. The VAT you pay will be used by government to develop our transport infrastructure like roads and railway lines, to continually improve our educational sector by building more schools and upgrading existing ones, to provide adequate security and a better quality of life for us all. Pay your VAT. Make your contributions to the development of Nigeria. It pays to pay your tax. This message is from the Federal Inland Revenue Service.
Immediately following the unveiling of the newborn baby, the 13th General Assembly of WATAF got underway with paper presentations around the theme of the Assembly, enhancing revenue potentials of West Africa. There were 2 panels, one on domestic resource mobilization and the other on automatic exchange of information.
The reality we have today is a lot of the tax revenue generation in sub-Saharan Africa actually comes from the formal sector. So if you look at Nigeria, where the informal sector is, contributes almost 50% of GDP and is barely taxed, it gives you a sense that there's still a lot of potential to generate revenues. So what are the challenges we've had across West Africa and, in fact, sub-Saharan Africa as a whole? There's under-resourced tax administrations, right? In a lot of countries, tax administrators struggle with the capacity to actually, generate the revenues that the country has the potential to generate. Like I said, we have a large informal sector, which is generally hard to tax. There's also the problem of the habit of tax avoidance. So a lot of people are used to not paying taxes, and then getting them to change that mindset to start to pay taxes is a struggle. We are highly dependent on natural resources across Africa. And what then happens is, whenever you have significant drops in the prices of those resources in the international market, domestic revenue, drops as well. And in fact, in many countries, Nigeria being a classic example, the dependence on natural resources has made the government to ignore, taxation as a potent source of domestic revenue. But in the last couple of years, we've seen a drive towards addressing that.
And this constant truth.
Taxpayers want to be comfortable that when they pay their taxes, they can see the results and the output of those taxes. So we will need to increase accountability. The government will have to be more accountable. And if this happens, it can also increase the willingness of people to comply.
There is reliance on external funding. There are exports of products and services from each country. And also, with these sources of funding comes some challenges. The first of those is the fact that we have foreign aids. Yes, they are right, they are good in assisting us in achieving our developmental objectives. But the reality is the fact that today, aids come with conditionalities. At times, some of these conditionalities are not acceptable to the host countries, but because they are associated with those funding, some of the countries just endure. At the end of the day, you see that there is a conflict between the desires of the country, the needs of the country, and the objective of the funding agencies. If care is not taken most of the time, some of these projects turn out to be moribund and they're never completed. It could even be more unfortunate if there are changes in government and the managers of the economy during the life of such foreign funding. There could also be economic shocks in the originating countries that will limit their ability to finance or to continue to render their assistance promised to the beneficiary organizations.
There was a very lucid wrap-up of Mr. Ashimolowo's paper by the chairman of the session.
We looked at the sources of funding to a government and look at taxes, loans, and spend a little more time on aids, which has become part of the problems that we face in Africa. He also emphasized the fact that we can no longer rely on commodities sale to sustain our development. And he also mentioned what has been mentioned earlier also, the issue of engagement with the private sector in particular when we are formulating our tax policies and in order to get their buy-in. The ease of paying taxes is very important. It was mentioned by both speakers. The lesser the burden of compliance, the easier it is for people to comply. He also touched on the very common issue of the large informal sector that pervades the continent. And I think before we end this event, we will be able to dimension that challenge and try to profile solution, because it's a common problem for every one of us. That sector is large, contributes largely to our gross domestic product, but the revenue from that source is very minimal. We are doing something in Nigeria, and if time permits, in course of discussion, we'll also shed light on some of the things we are trying to do to ensure that we bring them into the tax net.
There's this area that has not really been tapped in our region, that is property taxes. We have such nice structures all over West Africa, but we don't, tax them. We need to follow it up and make sure we bring property taxes and rent tax into the tax net. In the area of excise, We have a directive harmonizing the legislations of ECOWAS member states on excise duties. And last year, we also adopted a directive harmonizing excise duties on tobacco products in ECOWAS member states. And we strongly believe that if our member states implement this particular directive, it's going to increase domestic revenue.
From the participants.
About 2 or 3 issues struck me, starting first from the presentation by Mr. Adu. The issue of not demonizing taxpayers, kind of adopting an adversarial approach in tax administration. I endorse that. Belema raised a point about, yes, taxing corporate entities, and that's where we need to go. But I will find out in Africa who are the companies and who are the individuals. The companies, especially the private companies, are glorified individuals. Professor Dr. Phillips' Tax Reform Group of 2002-2003 in Nigeria recommended that small companies should not be handled by the federal tax authority in Nigeria, that the states, the subnational tax authorities should be allowed to assess companies that operate within their domains, because there is no difference. And as far back as even 20 or 30 years in Nigeria, the circular by the Federal Tax Authority even stated it as such.
The second panel session concentrated on automatic exchange of information. What are the benefits of automatic exchange of information?
The benefits, reduces the possibility for tax evasion, and then concealment of offshore wealth. It also minimizes costs to government and financial institutions, and generally maximizes efficiency. Other benefits include these. There's an increase in voluntary and timely compliance. Taxpayers are encouraged to report all relevant information, especially where they are aware that other third parties will provide that information to the Revenue Authority. Then it provides an opportunity for self-assessment, and then out of that we can have plans by which we can enhance the capacity of our institutions to be able to apply the rules in accordance with international standards, and therefore boost efforts in compliance, revenue mobilization.
In our bid to bring to you the past, the present, and a peep into the future of WATAF, Tax Matters spoke to the outgone chairman of WATAF, Mrs. Elfrida Tamba of the Liberian Revenue Authority.
We focus on, one, making sure that WATAF is empowered legally, that we were able to achieve. We also focus on entering a memorandum of understanding with ECOWAS. We completed the memorandum of understanding. We submitted a draft copy to ECOWAS, and we are still awaiting their response. And another key foundational output is the conclusion of a host country agreement with Nigeria. So from a foundation perspective, we aim to achieve 2 things. 1, empowering WATAF legally so that we consummate all of the agreements in keeping with our foundation agreement. That we were able to achieve. Secondly, we had to make sure that we conclude a host nation agreement with FRRS. That we were also able to achieve.
Mr. Adoyi Ahmed Esouavana of Togo is the new chairman of WATAF. He spoke on his plans for WATAF.
What we need to do is that we really need to make sure that WATAF is more dynamic. We have to make sure that all the ECOWAS authorities are more concerned about the activities that WATAF will be carrying out thereafter.
Today, we're talking about automatic exchange of information. We're talking about exchange of data. We're talking about capacity building. Are these things already happening, or is it WATAF that will be the bedrock of what that we're expecting in the future?
Comme vous le savez aujourd'hui, as you're well aware, no tax administration can work alone. So it is within the framework of WATAF that will be able to do this exchange of information that we are talking about. So WATAF is the veritable instrument that will enable us to achieve all that.
And finally, the one who spins the wheel, Executive Secretary WATAF, Mr. Batunde Oladapo. How has the journey been?
It's been a tough one. Getting people to commit to certain things especially things that are beyond their immediate purview, is often difficult. Let me expatiate further. To get member countries to get ratification of a WATAF agreement, in some instances, the country will have to go to parliament. They will need parliamentary approval. Or sometimes it could be, like the case of Nigeria, a Federal Executive Council approval, which takes time to schedule right from the tax authority. And then even in instances where you have the Commissioner General or head of tax administration having to ratify, he or she will have some considerations which are majorly political before signing. So it's been tough, but it's also a lesson in terms of coordination and helping people to see your worldview, to see the necessity of having a WATAF that is vibrant, a WATAF that will champion capacity building, a WATAF that will be the bridge between the tax administrations which are scattered in West Africa in terms of linguistic component.
What does the future hold? What are the plans to getting WATAF family on ground?
We have a 3-year strategy plan that's spell out certain obligations that the secretary has to drive. And one of it is to get a definite identity. With this milestone that we've reached, WATAF can now say, yes, I'm an organization that speaks to tax administration in West Africa. And with that, I know donor agencies will be able to do more for us so that we allow the FRS not to be overburdened. So part of the plan is to get the secretariat fully established and function as a secretariat, just like any other tax organization. And then beyond that is to expand our collaboration with other tax organizations beyond Africa. Currently, there's an initiative being sponsored under the auspices of the Addis Tax Initiative. And there's a forum called the Network of Tax Organizations. That's bringing like about 8 or 9 tax similar organizations globally. We have the SIAT, Qatar, the one from the Pacific, and all of them together under one umbrella. And the essence will be to warehouse expertise, to warehouse best practices, and then to harmonize capacity building initiative so that we will not be duplicating efforts. And also, we are looking on expanding, this current year, we are looking on expanding on capacity building. Yeah, initially, we started the Full Soldiers Initiative on transfer pricing, which we hope will dovetail into other areas of tax administration. And the target are manager-level staffs of tax administration. Previously, the capacity building has been focused more on management and high level. And we look at it that succession planning is not usually enforced. They go there, yes, but the full soldiers don't understand what you're talking about. This year, we're going to pick that up, and those crop of officials will now be the people we can send out a mini version of the Tax Without Border program, so that if there's a transfer pricing audit in any member country, those guys can go there and act like interns. That way they pick up skills. That way back home they will be able to add value. That way we ensure there's continuity in terms of passing down skills and expertise.
There you are. Like they say, there's a new kid on the block, West African Tax Administration Forum. Not forgetting the big continental brother, ATAF, African Tax Administration Forum. But now, the West African sub-region has its own voice when tax administrators gather. And so we wish the member countries of WATAF, the host country of the Secretariat, Nigeria, and FRS, the facilitator, the best of luck. And you, our viewers, we wish you the best in the coming weeks and months. Thank you for watching.